My daughter is a confused woman with delusions of importance. He said it to a reporter from the Shenandoah Register, used his anchor voice, the one that carried him through 31 years of local news, measured, warm, pitched to sound like the most reasonable man in any room. He said it, standing in the lobby of Senator Caldwell's district office. 3 feet behind his left shoulder, mounted in a brushed steel frame inside a locked glass display case, hung a classified operational citation bearing my alias. My name is Gwendolyn Marsh. I'm 43 years old. I've spent 18 years doing work I can't describe for an agency most people confuse with a different acronym. And the man who called me delusional to a newspaper was my father. He wasn't finished. He filed a legal petition in Clark County Circuit Court claiming I had abandoned the family, forfeited my inheritance, and exhibited signs of psychological instability. He attached a preliminary sale agreement for my mother's house, the house she was born in, the house she died in, and my signature sat at the bottom of page 6. I never signed it. If you've ever had someone stand in front of a room and tell your story for you, and every word was a lie they'd practiced until it felt true, stay with me. You're going to want to hear how this ends. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for 19 minutes. Not because I was early, because the fluorescent lights inside that building were going to do what fluorescent lights always do to me, send a deep ache radiating through the bone above my right eye, the orbital bone, the one that was fractured 6 years ago in a concrete room at a border checkpoint in a country I'm not permitted to name. I pressed my thumb into the scar, hard, held it there until the ache turned sharp, then specific, then manageable. It's a habit my handlers flagged in my medical file. They noted it the way you'd note a pilot's tendency to tap the altimeter before descent. Not a problem, just a tell. Something to watch. I handle international logistics. That's what I tell people. 4 words. Technically true. The way saying I work with water would be technically true if you were a deep-sea salvage diver. If you want to hear where this leads, and I promise it leads somewhere, hit subscribe now. I'll be here when you're ready. 16 months. That's how long I was embedded with a foreign partner service in the Balkans, running a source network that mapped a weapons smuggling corridor feeding directly into NATO ally territory. 16 months of sleeping in safe houses that smelled like diesel and wet plaster. 16 months of eating cold foil-packaged rations on a cot, memorizing cover legends, servicing dead drops in towns where the streetlights had been shot out years ago and nobody bothered to replace them. 16 months where the closest thing to a personal life was a 3-line message from my handler, routed through 2 cutouts and redacted down to the operational minimum. The last one read, "Family member relocated to memory care facility. Status stable, no action required. My mother, Eleanor Marsh, 61 years old, early onset Alzheimer's." And the message told me she'd been moved out of her own home, the home with the hydrangeas along the back porch, the home where she taught me to read standing on a kitchen chair so I could see the cookbook, and into a facility, stable, no action required. I ate the ration. I went back to work. 3 weeks later, a source was compromised and the extraction went sideways in a way that still visits me at 2 a.m. Border security forces. A concrete room. The fracture happened on the 3rd strike. I know because I was counting the way they trained us to count. Inventory your injuries, stay conscious, categorize the damage. They broke the bone above my right eye, left a scar I wear parted under my hair like a secret I've been keeping from everyone I've ever loved. The operation was later credited with severing a major arms pipeline. A classified commendation was issued. It hangs in a senator's office under my operational alias. I've never seen it in person. I was told it's in a brushed steel frame. I wasn't there for the commendation ceremony. I was in a military hospital in Germany letting a maxillofacial surgeon wire my orbital bone back together, and my mother was in a memory care facility in Virginia forgetting my name. I need to be honest about something. My father wasn't entirely wrong about the disappearing. I did disappear. For 2 decades, I chose the work over the family. I chose dead drops in the Balkans over Thanksgiving in Clark County. I chose protecting a continent over sitting beside my mother while she still remembered who I was. And by the time I came home for real, not just the 72-hour windows between postings, she had 3, maybe 4 lucid days left. I got 2 of them. That's not my father's fault. That's the cost of the life I chose. I carry it. I don't pretend it doesn't weigh anything. But there's a difference between being absent and being erased. A difference between a daughter who couldn't come home and a daughter who never mattered. My father decided to build the second version. Douglas Marsh, retired anchor, WVTV Channel 9. 31 years behind the desk, voice like polished oak, hands that moved in slow, deliberate arcs, open palm, guiding gesture, the way you'd steer a nervous interview subject toward the answer you'd already written for them. He treated every conversation like a broadcast, controlled the frame, unset the tone, decided what the audience needed to know, and, more importantly, what they didn't. When I was 12, he told a neighbor I was going through a shy phase. I was reading intelligence briefs my civics teacher had photocopied from a declassified archive. When I was 22 and told him I'd accepted a position with a federal agency, he paused for exactly 2 seconds. I counted and said, "Well, government work. That's steady, at least." Then he pivoted to tell me about his Emmy nomination, Regional Emmy. He kept it on the mantle next to a photo of himself shaking hands with the governor. He never asked what I did, not once, not in 18 years. And when my mother got sick, when the Alzheimer's started taking pieces of her, first the small things, the word for cinnamon, the name of the neighbor's dog, and then the bigger things, the year, the season, my face, my father did what he'd always done. He managed the narrative. He told extended family I'd been let go from my government job, that I'd been fired for instability, that I was drifting. He told Aunt Miriam I'd had some kind of breakdown overseas and come back not quite right. Miriam sat in his living room and nodded. She didn't call me. She didn't ask. She chose the comfort of his certainty, the familiar baritone, the steady hands, the confidence of a man who'd spent 3 decades telling other people what was true. The escalation was patient. That's the thing about my father. He doesn't lunge. He builds. First, dismissal. My career was a joke, a vague government job that paid nothing and meant nothing. He'd say it at dinner parties with a little shake of his head, the bemused father tolerating a daughter's hobby. Then erasure. I wasn't just unsuccessful. I wasn't there. He stopped mentioning me to family friends. When someone asked how Gwendolyn was doing, he'd say, "Oh, she's around," and change the subject with the smooth redirect of a man who'd spent decades cutting to commercial. Then rewriting. I wasn't absent because of work. I was absent because something was wrong with me. Fired, unstable, not to be trusted with important decisions. The story spread through Clark County the way his broadcast voice used to spread through living rooms, steady, authoritative, impossible to argue with, because he never raised his volume. He didn't need to. He was Douglas Marsh. People believed him the way they'd believed him when he told them it would rain on Thursday. And then he weaponized it. My mother died on a Tuesday in October. I was back in Virginia by then. I'd been back for 5 months, working out of a regional office, burning through backlogged administrative work, while my body finished healing and my agency decided where to put me next. I made it to the hospice. I held her hand. She didn't know who I was, but she held back. I choose to believe that counted for something. The will was straightforward. My mother had been precise while she still could be. The house, the property, and the remaining accounts split evenly between Douglas and me. The estate attorney, Martin Kessler, had the documents. Clean, notarized, filed. 2 months after the funeral, my father gave an interview to the Shenandoah Register. He stood in the lobby of Senator Caldwell's district office, a location he chose because it looked dignified on camera, because even retired he couldn't stop staging his own shots, and told a reporter that his daughter was confused, delusional, and had no legitimate claim to the family estate. 1 week later, he filed the petition. The document was 14 pages. I read it in Kessler's office at 9 a.m, standing because I couldn't sit. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the ache behind my eye started on page 2 and didn't stop. He claimed I had been absent from family affairs for 20 years. True enough, as far as he knew. He claimed I had demonstrated psychological instability. He cited my erratic employment history and my inability to maintain stable personal relationships. He claimed I had forfeited my right to the estate through abandonment, and on page 6, my signature sat at the bottom of a preliminary sale agreement authorizing the transfer of my mother's house, the hydrangeas, the back porch, the kitchen where I stood on a chair, to a developer who'd offered $340,000. The proceeds earmarked for a retirement property in Hilton Head. I stared at the signature, my name in handwriting that almost passed. The G was close, the loop on the H was close, but the pressure was wrong. I've signed classified documents in windowless rooms at 3 a.m, while a handler stood over my shoulder. I know what my signature looks like under stress, under fatigue, under fluorescent light. And this wasn't it. My father forged it. He forged my name to sell my mother's house. What happens next is the reason I'm telling you this story. The morning of the preliminary hearing, Clark County Circuit Court, I pulled into the parking lot at 8:41 a.m. The courthouse was a limestone building from 1952. The lot smelled like hot asphalt and boxwood hedges that needed trimming. I turned off the engine and sat there, 19 minutes. I pressed my thumb into the bone above my eye. I let it ache. I let myself remember the concrete room, the counting, the sound of my own breathing measured and deliberate, because if I stopped counting, I would scream. I let myself remember the 3-line message about my mother. I let myself feel all of it. The orbital fracture and the kitchen chair and the hydrangeas and the signature that wasn't mine on a document that would erase the last physical proof my mother ever existed in a place that loved her. Then I put my hand down. I checked my hair in the mirror, parted left, falling over the right eyebrow, covering the scar, covering the tell. I walked into that courthouse looking exactly like what my father told them I was. A quiet, vaguely employed woman in a dark blazer, carrying nothing but a leather folder and 18 years of silence. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled walls the color of weak tea, 2 counsel tables, a gallery with 8 rows of wooden benches. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed at a frequency that settled directly into the fracture line above my eye. E. Douglas sat at the petitioner's table, gray suit, blue tie, hair combed back the way he wore it on air. He was already performing, shoulders squared to the gallery, chin raised just enough to project authority without arrogance. His attorney, a man named Whitfield from Winchester, sat beside him arranging papers. And at the edge of the petitioner's table, reviewing a separate file, sat Martin Kessler, the estate attorney, 45, wire-rimmed glasses, quiet hands. Kessler looked up when I walked in. I watched his eyes track from my face to my right hand, which had already moved, 2 fingertips pressing the hairline above my eyebrow. The tell, the one my handlers noted. The one that was documented in an incident report written 6 years ago by a DIA analyst who sat in an operations center listening to field audio while a woman was being beaten in a concrete room at a border checkpoint in the Balkans. Kessler's pen stopped moving. He knew. I didn't know he knew. Not yet. I sat down at the respondent's table, alone. I'd waived the right to counsel for the preliminary hearing because bringing a lawyer meant explaining things I wasn't authorized to explain, and I opened my leather folder and I waited. Aunt Miriam sat in the second row of the gallery. She looked at me once, then looked away. She was wearing the same cardigan she'd worn to my mother's funeral. She'd chosen her seat on Douglas's side of the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Vance entered at 9:15. Gray hair, reading glasses on a chain. She opened the file, read for 45 seconds, and looked over her glasses at my father's table. "Mr. Whitfield, you may present." My father stood before his attorney could. Old habit, the anchor always leads. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, a smooth, practiced motion, and turned to face the courtroom with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 31 years telling 500,000 households what to think. And then he began to testify about the daughter he'd invented. The voice carried. That was the thing about Douglas Marsh. The voice always carried. "Your Honor, I want to be clear about something." He placed both hands on the rail of the witness box, palms flat, fingers spread. The open palm gesture. The one that says, "Trust me, I'm being transparent." This isn't about money. This isn't about property. Now, this is about a father trying to protect what's left of his family. He paused. Exactly 2 seconds. I counted the way I always count. My daughter has been absent from this family for the better part of 20 years. She left after college for what she described as a government consulting position. She couldn't tell us where she was. She couldn't tell us what she did. She missed holidays. She missed her mother's 60th birthday. She missed... His voice dropped half a register. The gravity note. I'd heard it 1,000 times growing up, every time the broadcast turned to a house fire or a missing child. She missed her mother's diagnosis. She missed the move to memory care. She missed the decline. He turned his body slightly toward the gallery, toward Miriam, including the audience. When Eleanor, my wife, was moved into memory care, I asked Gwendolyn to come home. I called her emergency contact number. I left messages. I was told she was unavailable. Unavailable. He let the words sit. My wife was losing her mind, and my daughter was unavailable. I pressed my fingertips into the orbital bone. I didn't move. I didn't look at him. After Eleanor passed, Gwendolyn resurfaced. She contested the estate plan. She made accusations about the sale agreement. He shook his head. Slow. Sad. The disappointed father. Your Honor, my daughter has struggled. Professionally, personally, she was let go from her government position. The details are unclear, but the pattern is not. She can't hold employment. She can't maintain relationships. And now she's fixated on a house she hasn't lived in since she was 18, because it's the last thing she can hold on to. Judge Vance looked at me over her reading glasses. Ms. Marsh, you've waived counsel. Do you wish to cross-examine? Not at this time, Your Honor. My father blinked, just once. He hadn't expected that. He'd prepared for an argument. He'd prepared for me to sound defensive, emotional, unstable, to prove his case for him. My silence wasn't in his script. He recovered fast. 31 years of live television teaches you to fill dead air. I want to add, he said, turning back to the judge, that my daughter's claims about the sale agreement are unfounded. I consulted with her by phone before preparing the document. She agreed to the terms. Her signature is on the agreement. The suggestion that it was forged is, frankly, Your Honor, It's the kind of accusation that concerns me. It's symptomatic of the pattern I've been describing. He smoothed his tie, sat down. Whitfield gave him a small nod. The courtroom was silent except for the fluorescent hum. Ms. Marsh, Judge Vance turned to me. The petitioner's counsel has submitted a preliminary sale agreement with what appears to be your signature. Do you dispute the document? I stood. I do, Your Honor. On what grounds? I didn't sign it. Can you provide evidence of forgery? I can provide a handwriting analysis conducted by a certified forensic document examiner. The report is in the file submitted to this court last Tuesday. I paused. I can also confirm that on the date the document was notarized, March 14th, I was engaged in operational duties in a location that I am not authorized to disclose through channels available to this proceeding. Whitfield stood immediately. Your Honor, the respondent's claim that she was in some undisclosed location performing secret work is exactly the kind of— Mr. Whitfield, Judge Vance held up one finger. Sit down. He sat. She looked at me for a long time. Ms. Marsh, you're telling this court you can't account for your whereabouts on March 14th because the information is classified? Yes, Your Honor. Can anyone verify that? I pressed my thumb into the bone above my eye. I felt the scar through my hair. Not through channels available to this proceeding. Douglas exhaled through his nose. A small sound, one controlled, the sound of a man who believes he's winning. He leaned toward Whitfield and murmured something I couldn't hear, but I could read the shape of his mouth. I've spent 18 years reading the shapes of mouths in rooms where I couldn't hear the words. He said, "This is what I'm talking about." Judge Vance set down her pen. This court is going to recess for 20 minutes. I want to review the forensic document analysis in the respondent's filing. She stood. The bailiff called the room to order. During the recess, I stayed at my table. I didn't stand, I didn't stretch. I opened my leather folder and looked at the single sheet inside. Not a legal document, a photograph. My mother on the back porch, holding a coffee mug, squinting into the sun. The hydrangeas behind her were blooming. Somebody had written on the back in her handwriting, the letters still steady, still sure, for Gwen. Don't let him stage this one. I closed the folder. Douglas stood by the water cooler with Whitfield, speaking in low tones, his hand making that open palm gesture, guiding, shaping, directing the conversation the way he always directed everything. Kessler stood apart from them. He hadn't spoken to Douglas since my testimony. He was looking at his phone, but his eyes weren't moving. He wasn't reading. He was thinking. Aunt Miriam was still in the second row. She was looking at me. When I met her eyes, she didn't look away this time. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something. Then she closed it. She pressed her hand against her chest. Her face had gone pale. I noticed it before anyone else in the room. Her lips were gray, not white. Gray, the color of inadequate perfusion. Her right hand moved from her chest to the bench beside her, gripping the wood, her eyes unfocused, her chin dropped. I was already moving. I vaulted the gallery rail with one hand, my blazer catching on the wood and tearing at the shoulder seam. I reached Miriam in 3 strides. Her body was sliding sideways off the bench. Her head struck the armrest, a sharp, hard crack against the corner, and I got my hands under her a half-second later, lowering her the rest of the way to the floor in a controlled descent, one hand cradling her cervical spine, the other guiding her shoulder. "Bailiff!" My voice carried like a command frequency, sharp, flat, no warmth in it. Call 911, tell them syncopal episode, possible cardiac origin, female, approximately 68 years old, responsive to pain, unresponsive to voice. The bailiff stared at me. Now, he moved. I knelt beside Miriam and ran a primary survey the way I was trained to run it, not in a hospital, not in a first aid course, but in a DIA tactical medical module designed for officers operating in environments where the nearest hospital might be in a different country. Airway. I tilted her chin, swept her mouth. Clear. Breathing. Present but shallow, rate approximately 8, circulation, radial pulse, weak, rapid, thready. I counted for 6 seconds and multiplied, approximately 110. Ma'am! I pressed my knuckles into her sternum. Miriam, open your eyes. Her eyelids fluttered. No verbal response. Pain response, positive. I turned her onto her left side. Recovery position. Or I kept one hand on her cervical spine and used my other hand to loosen the top button of her cardigan. The same cardigan from the funeral. It smelled like lavender sachet and closet air. I need someone's belt. I didn't look up. A belt or a rolled jacket, I need to stabilize her head. Someone handed me a belt. I folded it, placed it against her temple to keep her head aligned with her spine, and held it there. That's when my hair fell. I'd been kneeling, leaning over Miriam, working fast. The part I keep so carefully arranged, left side falling over the right eyebrow, covering the scar, covering the tell, shifted. Gravity and motion did what they always do. The hair slid back behind my ear and stayed there. The scar sat exposed under the courtroom's overhead lights. A thin, pale line running diagonally across my right orbital ridge. Precise, surgical in how clean it looked now, 6 years after the stitches, but unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at. If you'd read the field report, if you'd written the incident summary, if you'd sat in an operations center in a building with no windows, listening to audio from a concrete room at a Balkan border checkpoint while an officer was beaten and you documented each injury in real time because that was your job. Martin Kessler was standing 6 feet away. I didn't see him at first. I was watching Miriam's breathing, counting the rate, keeping my hand steady on her spine. But I felt someone's stillness, not the frozen stillness of a bystander who doesn't know what to do. The controlled stillness of someone who's processing something they'd filed away years ago and suddenly needs to retrieve. I looked up. Kessler was staring at the scar. His lips were parted. His wire-rimmed glasses had slid down his nose, and he hadn't pushed them back. His right hand was gripping the file folder he'd been holding, gripping it hard enough that the manila cover had buckled under his thumb. His eyes moved from the scar to my hand, the one pressing Miriam's cervical spine. 2 fingertips positioned exactly where a DIA tactical medical protocol specifies. Not the Red Cross method, not the EMT method, the agency method. The one they teach you when you might need to stabilize a colleague in a vehicle moving at speed through a hostile corridor. Thumb on the mastoid process. Index and middle finger bracketing C3 and C4. He knew that hand position. He'd written about it. Our eyes met. I watched the recognition complete itself. Not a guess, not a suspicion. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from matching a specific detail in front of you to a specific detail in a file you wrote 6 years ago. A file that documented an orbital fracture sustained during an emergency extraction, describing the scar location, the dimensions, the officer's involuntary habit of touching the site under stress. He hadn't just read about me, he'd listened to it happen. He'd heard the field audio. He'd heard me counting. He pushed his glasses back up his nose with one finger. He looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the bench. Judge Vance had come back into the courtroom when the commotion started. She was standing near her chamber's door, watching me stabilize Miriam. Your Honor. Kessler's voice was quiet, steady, but underneath the steadiness, I heard something I recognized, the particular tension of someone deciding to break a professional silence. I need to approach the bench immediately. Mr. Kessler, we're in the middle of— Your Honor, I have material relevant to the respondent's credibility that this court needs to hear before proceeding. And I have items entrusted to me by Eleanor Marsh to be delivered under specific conditions. Those conditions have been met. Judge Vance studied him. Then she looked at me, still kneeling on the courtroom floor, holding Miriam's head steady, the scar on full display, my torn blazer hiked up over my shoulder. "Approach," she said. Kessler walked to the bench carrying two things: the file folder he'd been gripping, and a small cardboard box I hadn't seen before, plain, taped shut, with handwriting on the top I couldn't read from the floor. Douglas was standing now. The anchor composure was cracking. He wasn't used to segments he didn't control. "Your Honor, I object to— This is my attorney. He represents the estate, not Mr. Marsh." Judge Vance didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Sit down. Mr. Kessler represents the estate of Eleanor Marsh, not you." Douglas sat. His hands went flat on the table. I watched his fingers press into the wood. No open palm, no guiding gesture, just pressure. Kessler set both items on the bench. He opened the file folder first. "Your Honor, before I attended law school, I spent 6 years as an analyst in the Defense Intelligence Agency's Operations Center. During that time, I monitored field operations across multiple theaters." He paused. "I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics of those operations, but I can tell this court, under oath and subject to penalty of perjury, that the woman kneeling on that floor is not a confused government consultant. She is not unemployed. She is not unstable." He turned and looked directly at my father. "The woman her father described to a newspaper as delusional holds a classified operational commendation for service that I personally documented. I was the analyst listening on communications during her extraction from a hostile environment. I wrote the incident report that described the injuries she sustained, including the orbital fracture that left the scar this court can see right now on her face, because she just used agency-specific tactical medical protocol to save a woman who chose to sit on her father's side of the courtroom. The room was silent, not the silence of a pause, the silence of a room recalibrating everything it thought it knew. Douglas's mouth opened. No sound came out. I watched his jaw work, the muscles along his temple flexing, releasing, flexing again. For the first time in my life, I watched my father search for words and find nothing. Kessler placed his hand on the cardboard box. "This was entrusted to me by Eleanor Marsh during her final lucid period. She gave me specific instructions. I was to deliver it to her daughter when—" His voice caught, just barely. He cleared his throat. "When she needed it most." He looked at Judge Vance. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, this box contains video recordings made by the decedent. The final recording is directly relevant to the forgery allegation before this court." Judge Vance looked at the box. She looked at me, still on the floor with Miriam, whose breathing had steadied to 12 per minute, whose color was returning, whose pulse I could feel strengthening under my fingertips. She looked at Douglas. "Play it," she said. The bailiff brought a laptop from the clerk's office. Kessler opened the box carefully. Inside were 4 USB drives, each labeled in my mother's handwriting, steady letters, clear dates. The handwriting of a woman who knew she was running out of time and refused to waste what was left. He inserted the last drive, dated 11 days before she lost coherence for good. The bailiff angled the screen toward the judge, but the courtroom was small and the speakers carried. My mother's face filled the screen. She was sitting at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table. The one with the nick on the corner where I dropped a cast iron skillet when I was 9. Behind her, through the window, the hydrangeas were fading into autumn bronze. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were clear, focused. The woman I remembered before the disease started taking inventory of everything she was. She looked directly into the camera. "This is Eleanor Marsh. Today is October 3rd. She paused, took a breath. "I'm recording this because there are things my daughter needs to know, and I may not be able to tell her myself. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe less. Douglas doesn't know I'm making these." Her hands were folded on the table. I could see them trembling, but her voice didn't. "Douglas has been talking to a developer about the house. I heard him on the phone last Tuesday. He thinks I don't understand what's happening around me anymore. Most days he's right, but I understood that call." She unfolded her hands and pressed them flat against the table. "He started taking things the day I couldn't remember what day it was." I heard Miriam make a small sound from the floor beside me. She was conscious now. She was listening. "He told me Gwendolyn was fired. He told me she wasn't coming back. I didn't believe him. But I couldn't. I couldn't hold the argument. The words would come and then they'd go. He'd tell me something, and by dinner I couldn't remember if it was true or something I dreamed." Her chin dropped. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. "My daughter didn't abandon this family. She served this country. She can't tell me how, and I've never asked. I don't need to. I know who she raised herself to be." She reached off camera and came back with a piece of paper. She held it up. A photocopy of the preliminary sale agreement, page 6. "This is not Gwendolyn's signature. I watched Douglas practice it at this table. He used a letter she sent me from overseas, the only letter she was able to send, and he traced the signature at the bottom. He thought I was asleep in the next room. I wasn't asleep. I was counting the days I have left where I can still see what's happening in my own house." She set the paper down. "Marty, if you're watching this, please make sure my daughter gets what's hers. And please make sure my husband doesn't take the house. Not because I'm angry, because she needs to know I saw her, even when she thought nobody did." The screen held her face for 4 more seconds, looking at the camera, looking at me. Then it went dark. The fluorescent tubes hummed. Nobody moved. I was still kneeling on the floor beside Miriam, my hand on her cervical spine, my torn blazer hanging off my shoulder, the scar over my eye exposed under the courthouse lights. My mother's voice was still in the air. I could feel it the way you feel a vibration after a bell stops ringing. I didn't cry. I pressed my thumb into the orbital bone. I held it there. I counted. Judge Vance removed her reading glasses. She set them on the bench. She folded her hands and looked at my father for a long time. "Mr. Marsh." Her voice was quiet, controlled. A different kind of control than his, the kind that doesn't perform. "This court has reviewed the forensic document analysis submitted by the respondent. The analysis concludes that the signature on page 6 of the sale agreement is inconsistent with known exemplars of the respondent's handwriting, with particular attention to pen pressure, baseline slant, and the formation of the capital G. This conclusion is now supported by the decedent's own testimony." Douglas stood. His hands were shaking. I'd never seen his hands shake. Not in 31 years of live broadcast, not at my mother's funeral, not once. "Your Honor?" I "Sit down, Mr. Marsh. I'm not finished." He sat, his open palm pressed flat against the table, not guiding anything, holding himself upright. "The petition for forfeiture of estate rights is dismissed. The preliminary sale agreement is voided. The property remains subject to the original terms of Eleanor Marsh's will." She picked up her pen. "Further, this court is referring the matter of the forged signature to the Clark County Commonwealth's Attorney for Investigation of Potential Criminal Fraud." The forensic document analysis, the decedent's video testimony, and Mr. Kessler's sworn statement regarding the respondent's verified government service will be included in the referral packet. She looked at Whitfield. Counselor, I'd advise your client to retain criminal defense representation. Then she looked at me. Ms. Marsh, the paramedics are on their way for your aunt. You've done good work. She paused. In more ways than one, it appears. She collected her files and left the bench. I stayed on the floor with Miriam until the EMTs arrived 7 minutes later. Her vitals were stable. Her color was back. Her eyes were open and tracking. She looked up at me while I held her head steady. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, I should have called you. Yes, I believed him. I know. The EMTs took over. I stood. My knees ached from the courtroom floor. My blazer was torn. My hair was still pushed back, the scar uncovered. And for the first time in years, I didn't reach up to fix it. Douglas was still sitting at the petitioner's table. Whitfield was packing his briefcase with the mechanical efficiency of a lawyer who knows the engagement is over. Kessler was standing by the bench, the cardboard box of USB drives held against his chest with both hands. My father looked at me. The anchor composure was gone. What was left underneath was smaller than I expected. Not monstrous, not defiant, just a man who had built his understanding of the world around being seen, and who had just discovered that the person he'd dismissed for being invisible had been doing more consequential work than he could comprehend. He opened his mouth. Gwen! I picked up my leather folder from the respondent's table. I walked past him without stopping. I heard his chair scrape. I heard him take one step. I heard him stop. The hallway smelled like lemon polish and old radiator heat. I walked through it with the folder under my arm and the ache in my orbital bone settling into something quieter, something almost still. The EMTs were loading Miriam into the ambulance when I reached the parking lot. The afternoon had gone cool. December air. The boxwood hedges cast long shadows across the asphalt. Kessler caught up with me at my car. Gwendolyn, I turned. He held out the cardboard box. There are 3 more recordings. She wanted you to have all of them. He paused, adjusted his glasses. I heard the field audio. During your extraction, I was the one on the desk that night. His voice was steady, but his jaw tightened. I wrote the report that documented the orbital fracture. I described the scar location, the stress response habit, all of it. When you walked into that courtroom this morning and touched your eyebrow, I knew who you were before you sat down. I took the box. It weighed almost nothing. 4 USB drives and the last lucid thoughts of a woman who loved me. Why didn't you say something before the hearing started? Because you waived counsel. Because you walked in alone. Because in 6 years at the agency, the only officers I ever saw do that were the ones who had a plan. He almost smiled. I figured you'd earn the right to run your own operation. I held the box against my ribs. Thank you, Marty. He nodded once, turned, walked back toward the courthouse. His shoes clicked on the asphalt, and then he was gone. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I didn't press the scar. I didn't count. I just held the box on my lap and breathed. The consequences arrived the way consequences do in a small county. Not in a single avalanche, but in a slow, steady erosion that the person at the center is always the last to fully grasp. I learned most of it secondhand. Helen Parker at the post office mentioned to Kessler's paralegal that Douglas had been asked to step down from the Clark County Historical Society board. The paralegal mentioned it to Kessler. Kessler mentioned it to me during a routine call about the estate paperwork. The Commonwealth's attorney opened a formal investigation into the forgery within 2 weeks. Douglas retained a criminal defense attorney out of Winchester, Richard Bellamy, $350 an hour. The retainer alone was $8,400. Kessler told me the forensic document examiner's report had been entered into the investigation file along with my mother's video testimony and 2 additional sworn statements from the notary who'd witnessed the sale agreement, who, when confronted with the evidence, admitted Douglas had presented the document pre-signed and asked him to notarize it without the second party present. The notary's license was suspended pending review. The Shenandoah Register ran a correction, 4 sentences, buried on page 11. But in a county with 32,000 people, page 11 gets read. The Rotary Club didn't renew Douglas's speaking invitation for the spring dinner. The branch manager at the Clark County Savings and Loan, where Douglas had banked for 40 years, required a co-signer on his next transaction. Small things. The kind of things that happen when a town decides quietly and without announcement that a man's word isn't what it used to be. I heard from Miriam once, a handwritten note delivered through Kessler's office, 3 lines. I sat in that living room and let him talk. I didn't question any of it. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I kept the note. I didn't write back immediately. But I didn't throw it away. Some doors you leave open, not because you're ready to walk through them, but because closing them permanently costs something you're not willing to spend. Douglas texted me once, 5 weeks after the hearing, 11 words. I didn't know who you were. Can we talk sometime? I read it. I set the phone on the counter. I never replied. He wasn't wrong that he didn't know who I was. He'd had 18 years to ask. The information was never classified. The question was free. He just never thought the answer would matter. That night, I sat in my mother's kitchen. The house was mine now. Mine and the hydrangeas and the nick on the table and the porch where the morning light hits first. The counters smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood. The window was dark. I opened the laptop. I plugged in the first USB drive. My mother appeared on the screen. Earlier than the courtroom recording. The hydrangeas were still purple. Summer light. She was smiling. Gwen, I don't know when you'll see this. I hope it's a long time from now. I hope I'm sitting next to you and we're laughing about how dramatic I was. She told me about the garden, about the raccoon that had been getting into the compost, about how she'd reorganized the spice drawer and couldn't find the cinnamon. And then she laughed and said, I know, of all the things to forget. I watched all 4 recordings, each one shorter than the last, each one with her voice a little further away, like a radio signal at the edge of its range. In the 3rd one, she forgot what she'd been saying and sat quietly for 30 seconds looking at her hands. Then she looked up and said, Tell Gwen I was here. The 4th was the courtroom video. I'd already heard it. I watched it again. I paused on the last frame, her face looking directly into the camera, steady, clear. The woman she was before the disease took the rest. I didn't press play again. I closed the laptop. I picked up the photograph from my leather folder, the porch, the coffee mug, the squinting smile. I turned it over for Gwen. Don't let him stage this one. I put it on the refrigerator, held it there with a magnet shaped like the state of Virginia that had been on that refrigerator since I was 11. Then I walked out onto the back porch. The air was cold. December in the valley cold. The kind that smells like wood smoke and frozen ground, and the particular mineral tang of the Shenandoah River somewhere to the west. The sky was just beginning to lighten along the ridge. Not dawn yet. The suggestion of dawn. The hydrangeas were bare stalks in the dark, but they'd bloom again in June. They always do. I stood there with my hands at my sides. I didn't press the scar. The ache behind my orbital bone was quiet. Not gone. It never goes entirely, but quiet. The way an old fracture settles when the atmospheric pressure is right, and the body finally believes, for a few minutes, that it's safe. My mother saw me. She saw me when no one else did, when I couldn't tell her why I'd gone or where, when the only proof I existed was a 3-line redacted message and a signature on a letter I wasn't supposed to send. She saw me, and she made sure there'd be evidence. I breathed the cold air. I watched the ridgeline sharpen against the sky. The people who love you don't need to see your work to know its weight. They just need to see you. And the people who only believe what they can broadcast were never looking in the first place. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person in the room whose work was invisible, whose sacrifice was quiet, whose truth had to wait until someone finally bothered to look, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me about the person who saw you when no one else did. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button now. I have more stories like this one, and I think they'll find you at exactly the right time.